The air in the royal chamber was thick with dread, each shadow a monster lying in wait. King Sebastian Dusk, a man forged from violence and whispers of cruelty, turned his gaze upon his new bride, a prize bought and paid for. Aria Morgan braced for the end, for the crushing dominance of the Alpha King. He reached for her, his touch meant to claim and conquer. But the moment his skin met hers, the world fractured. The beast within him, the source of all his power, did not roar in triumph. It whimpered. It fell to its knees. The most feared man in the 5 kingdoms stared at the woman he'd purchased, his eyes wide not with lust, but with sheer, terrified disbelief. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The oppressive silence of Duke Aria Morgan's study was a physical weight. Sunlight, thick and golden, streamed through the tall, stained glass windows, illuminating a million dust motes dancing in lazy spirals over worn maps and stacks of ledgers bound in cracking leather. It was a light that should have brought warmth, but in this room, it only seemed to highlight the cold. Aria stood by the massive, unlit hearth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She felt less like a daughter and more like a porcelain doll placed just so, a beautiful, silent ornament in a room dedicated to cold transactions. Across a vast desk of polished oak, her father finalized the alliance, his quill scratched against the heavy parchment, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. Opposite him sat General Kull, King Sebastian's envoy, a mountain of a man whose dark steel plate armor seemed to absorb the very light from the room. His face was a mask of grim lines and old scars, and his gaze, when it swept the room, passed over Aria as if she were no different from the tapestries or the suits of armor standing sentinel in the corners. His silence was a threat more potent than any spoken word. The air was thick with the intermingled scents of old leather, melting sealing wax, and a betrayal so profound it felt like its own cloying perfume. The final scratch of the quill ceased. A heavy seal was thumped onto hot wax. The deal was done. General Kull rose, his armor groaning in protest. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the Duke, completely ignoring Aria, and turned to leave. The thud of his iron-soled boots on the marble floor echoed like hammer blows against a coffin lid. The moment the heavy doors closed behind him, the suffocating quiet returned, heavier than before. The room, once a place of childhood comfort where her father had taught her letters and history, now felt like a courtroom, a place of judgment where her sentence had just been irrevocably passed. Aria finally moved, her silk dress whispering over the stone. She walked to the desk, placing her palms flat upon its cold, polished surface. Her father still refused to meet her eyes, busying himself with tidying the signed documents, his movements clipped and unnaturally precise. "You speak of alliances and resources." Aria's voice was low, a stark contrast to the tremor that ran through her body. It cracked. But she forced the words out, needing them to be heard, needing to give voice to the horror. "Say what it is, father. Say it plainly. You are selling me. You are selling your daughter to a monster for gold and grain." Duke Alaric finally looked up, and his eyes were as cold and hard as the jewels on his fingers. There was no apology in them, no flicker of paternal love, only a weary, unyielding pragmatism. "This union will save thousands from starvation," he said, his tone flat and emotionless, as if discussing crop yields or trade tariffs. "Our granaries are nearly empty, our treasury depleted. The Duskfall Kingdom has what we need to survive the winter. This is not a sale, Aria. It is a sacrifice. Your duty is not to your own happiness, but to your people." He stood, pushing his chair back. "He is a king. You will be a queen. That is more than many receive. You should be grateful for the honor." Gratitude felt like a shard of glass in her throat. Honor was a gilded cage. "Honor," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "You call this honor? To be handed over to a man whose name is only ever spoken in the same breath as brutal, ruthless, tyrant? They say he tore the throat out of his own uncle to claim his throne. They say his wolf is a demon given flesh. They say many things, her father replied, turning away from her to gaze out the window at the lands he was so desperate to save. And you will be his wife. You will be safe. That is the end of this discussion. The journey into shadow began the very next morning. There was no time for long goodbyes, no tearful farewells with her ladies in waiting or the servants who had known her since birth. She was escorted to a heavy black carriage, its doors emblazoned with the snarling wolf's head of the Duskfall crest. The guards were Sebastian's men, silent and imposing in their dark armor, their faces hidden behind grim helms. As the carriage rumbled away from the gleaming white walls of her ancestral home, Aria pressed her face to the window, watching the lush green hills and vibrant wildflower meadows of her youth recede. The land of her birth was a tapestry of bright, sun-drenched color. She watched it until it was just a faint line on the horizon, a memory swallowed by distance. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing landscape outside her window. The rolling green hills gave way to the jagged tooth-like peaks of the northern mountains. The forest grew darker, the trees taller and more menacing, their branches clawing at a sky that had become a perpetual sheet of overcast gray. The very air seemed to grow colder, seeping through the carriage walls. The landscape was a perfect physical manifestation of King Sebastian's fearsome reputation, a land as harsh and unforgiving as its master. She sat on the cold leather of the carriage seat, a prisoner in everything but name, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Her internal world was a storm of betrayal, grief, and a bone, deep terror that was her constant companion. She mourned the loss of her future, the simple dream of marrying for love, of having a family and a home filled with light and laughter. Most of all, she mourned the father she thought she knew, the man who had held her hand and told her stories, now replaced by a cold strategist who saw her as a pawn to be sacrificed. Yet beneath the layers of sorrow and fear, a small, hard kernel of something else was beginning to form. It was a stubborn refusal to be completely broken, a spark of defiance in the face of utter despair. She would not give this monster the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The journey ended abruptly. The carriage jolted to a halt, and the door was pulled open, letting in a blast of biting wind that smelled of pine, wet stone, and the distant, acrid smoke of forges. Aria stepped out and looked up, her breath catching in her throat. The onyx citadel was not so much built as it was gouged from the side of a colossal mountain. It was a brutalist masterpiece of black stone and dark iron, a fortress that made no concession to beauty. There were no decorative flourishes, no graceful spires or welcoming gardens. There were only towering, unscalable walls, grim crenellations, and narrow arrow slits that stared down like the eyes of a predator. It was a structure designed for one purpose: war. This was not a home. It was a bastion of power, a declaration of dominance written in stone and shadow. As the massive iron gates groaned open to admit her, Aria pulled her cloak tighter, the cold of the place seeping into her bones. She was here. She had been delivered to the heart of the beast's lair. Her descent was complete. She lifted her chin, her expression hardening into a mask of numb composure. She was Aria of House Morgan, and though she had been sold, she would not be so easily bought. The wedding was not held in a sunlit temple or a fragrant garden. It took place in the great hall of the Onyx Citadel, a cavernous space that served as a throne room, war council, and feasting hall all in one. The air was thick with the smoke of countless torches that did little to banish the oppressive shadows clinging to the high, vaulted ceiling. Instead of flowers, the stone walls were adorned with faded battle banners depicting the snarling wolf of Duskfall, each one telling a story of conquest and bloodshed. The hall was filled not with the perfumed nobility of Aria's home, but with King Sebastian's court, a formidable assembly of powerful, scarred alphas and their mates. They were warriors, every one of them, dressed in practical leather and dark furs, their faces hard, their bodies honed for battle. They watched her approach with a predatory curiosity, their eyes missing nothing, sizing her up as she walked the long aisle toward the throne. They were not judging her beauty, but her strength, her suitability to be the mate of their Alpha King. She felt like a deer walking into a den of wolves. Sebastian was not waiting for her at an altar. He stood before a massive throne, carved from a single piece of black obsidian, a formidable figure radiating an aura of raw, untamed power that was almost a physical force. He was even more imposing in person than the rumors suggested, taller than any man she had ever seen, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark tunic. A jagged scar cut down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye and disappearing into the thick black beard that framed a mouth set in a permanent, unsmiling line. He watched her approach, his dark eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky, offering no comfort, no welcome. He was not a groom. He was a king claiming a tribute. There was no priest. An ancient, grim-faced Alpha, his own face a roadmap of old battles, stepped forward to perform the rite. He did not speak the common tongue, but a guttural, ancient language that felt as old as the mountains themselves. The words were not about love or union, but about binding and blood. It was a pagan ritual, a claiming. Aria stood before Sebastian, a ghost in a white dress, her face a mask of numb composure. She felt her mind detach, floating somewhere above her body, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The old Alpha took her hand, his skin as rough as bark, and placed it in Sebastian's. The king's grip was firm, his fingers calloused and strong, enveloping hers completely. His touch was not cruel, but it was possessive, a silent declaration of ownership. The vows were simple, brutal, and spoken in the common tongue for all to understand. "You are his," the old Alpha rasped, looking at Aria. "He is yours," he said, turning his gaze to Sebastian. "The pack is one." Aria's voice was a faint whisper when she repeated her assent, the words feeling alien on her tongue. Sebastian's response was a low, resonant rumble that vibrated through the hall, a sound of pure command. And with that, it was done. She was bound to him, to his kingdom, to his pack. She was Aria of House Dusk, a queen in a land of shadows. The ceremony gave way immediately to the feast. The long, rough-hewn tables were slammed into place by servants, and the air, already thick with smoke, was soon filled with the smell of roasted meat, spilled mead, and the primal scent of unwashed warriors. The feast was a loud, boisterous affair, a stark contrast to the refined, quiet banquets of her father's court. Here, men roared with laughter, pounded their fists on the tables for more drink, and tore into whole roasted boars and sides of venison with their hands and daggers. It was a feast of wolves, and Aria, seated at the head table beside her new husband, had never felt more alone. Sebastian completely ignored her. He was turned toward General Kyle, his head bent low as they spoke in quiet, serious tones, their conversation punctuated by sharp gestures toward a map unrolled between them. They spoke of border skirmishes with the wild clans of the north, of pack disputes in the western territories, of the logistics of moving troops before the first snows fell. Aria sat in her gilded cage, a queen in name, but invisible in reality. A serving girl placed a platter of rich, dark meat in front of her, but the sight and smell of it turned her stomach. She picked at a piece of hard bread, her throat too tight to swallow. The drink was a strong, dark mead that burned its way down, offering no comfort, only a dulling of her senses she desperately craved but could not allow. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her. The mates of the Alphas, seated amongst their men, were as formidable as their partners. They were strong, hardened women with knowing eyes and scars of their own. Women who had likely fought and bled alongside their mates. They watched Aria with a mixture of pity and contempt, They saw her fine silk dress, her pale, unblemished skin, her delicate manners. They saw a soft southern lamb, a fragile doll who would surely be shattered by the harsh realities of their world. And by the man who was their king. She felt their judgment like a physical blow, another layer of ice forming around her heart. She was an outsider, a foreign object, a price that had been paid, and nothing more. After what felt like an eternity, an older serving woman with a stern, unsmiling face approached the head table. She gave a stiff bow. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The king's chambers are prepared. I am to show you the way." Aria looked at Sebastian, but he did not even glance in her direction, still engrossed in his conversation. A cold dread washed over her. This was it. The transaction was to be completed. She rose, her legs unsteady, and followed the woman from the great hall. The cacophony of the feast faded behind her, replaced by the echoing silence of the stone corridors. The passages were lit by single torches set far apart, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on the cold walls. Each step took her further into the heart of the citadel, further from everything she had ever known. The royal chamber was at the end of a long, guarded hallway. The woman pushed open a heavy oak door and gestured for Aria to enter, before pulling the door closed behind her, leaving her alone. The room was surprisingly sparse, a warrior's chamber, not a king's. It was dominated by a huge bed, a formidable piece of furniture piled high with dark, heavy furs. A fire roared in a cavernous hearth, its hungry flames casting flickering, monstrous shadows across the stone walls, where racks of swords and axes gleamed dully in the firelight. The air was hot and close, thick with the scent of wood smoke and something else, something musky and masculine that was purely Sebastian. The numb detachment that had carried her through the day finally shattered, and the terror she had held at bay for so long crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was the moment she had dreaded above all others. She was his property, his prize. He would take her, not with tenderness or passion, but with the same brutal efficiency with which he waged war. It would be a consummation of power, an act of possession to solidify his claim. She braced herself for the pain, for the humiliation, for the final crushing end of the girl she once was. She was a sacrifice, and the altar was waiting. The heavy door creaked open, and the sound made her flinch. Sebastian filled the doorway, his massive frame seeming to block out the light from the corridor. He closed the door, and the latch clicked into place with a sound of absolute finality. The room, which had seemed large, suddenly felt small and suffocating. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering firelight. His eyes, dark and intense, held an unnerving intent that made her blood run cold. He said nothing, the silence stretching, amplifying the frantic beating of her own heart. Then he began to move. He approached her slowly, deliberately, his boots silent on the stone floor. Each step was a measured, predatory advance, the stalking of a wolf closing in on its cornered prey. Aria stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, her body rigid with a mixture of terror and defiance. She would not scream, she would not beg. She would meet her fate with the dignity of the house she no longer belonged to. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his large, calloused hand moving not for her face or her dress, but for her arm. It was not a gentle touch. It was a grip, meant to claim, to conquer, to assert his dominance without a single word. His fingers wrapped around her forearm, his skin hot against hers. The moment his skin met hers, the world fractured. It was not a spark. It was a silent thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the room. For Aria, It was a jolt of pure energy, a current that shot up her arm and exploded in her chest, not painful, but overwhelming. A shocking sensation that stole the air from her lungs, but for Sebastian, it was a cataclysm, the constant roaring inferno of his wolf, the beast that was the source of all his power and rage, the dominant voice that had screamed in his mind for as long as he could remember, did not surge in triumph. It did not roar its claim, it whimpered. The savage, indomitable spirit within him, the alpha of alphas, fell silent. Then, in the deafening quiet of his own mind, a new sound emerged. It was a whisper, a sound of pure, unadulterated reverence. The beast inside him, the monster feared by all, was not claiming her. It was bowing. It fell to its knees in utter, impossible submission. The shock was so profound, so alien, that it manifested physically. Sebastian stumbled back as if he had been struck, his hand flying from her arm as if her skin had burned him. He stared at his own hand, his fingers trembling slightly, looking at it as if it were a venomous snake that had just betrayed him. His carefully constructed composure, the mask of ruthless control he had worn his entire life, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He looked at her, and his eyes, once dark with intent, were now wide with sheer, terrified disbelief. "What are you?" he finally managed to say, his voice stripped of all its command, a harsh, ragged whisper that was swallowed by the roaring fire. He took another unsteady step back. "What sorcery is this?" Aria stared at him, her own terror evaporating like mist in the sun, replaced by a wave of utter astonishment. The most feared man in the 5 kingdoms, the ruthless Alpha King, was looking at her not with lust or dominance, but with a raw, naked vulnerability that bordered on fear. In that moment, as he stood there shaken and confused, a dawning, terrifying sense of power began to bloom in the center of her chest. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably destroyed. Aria awoke with a gasp. The furs of the massive bed tangled around her legs. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, pulsing red light across the chamber. For a moment, the terror of the previous night returned, a cold phantom that clutched at her heart. But the room was empty. Sebastian was gone. The silence that remained was different from the oppressive quiet of her father's study or the echoing emptiness of the corridors. This silence was charged, humming with the unanswered questions that hung in the air between them. She was alone, but his presence, his confusion and fear, lingered like a ghost. She rose, her limbs stiff, and found a simple woolen robe laid out for her. The fine silk of her wedding dress lay in a heap on the floor, a pale, discarded skin. As she dressed, she noticed the heavy oak door was shut fast. When she tried the handle, it was locked from the outside. A new kind of cold, one born of indignation rather than fear, seeped into her bones. He had imprisoned her. 2 guards, stone-faced and silent in their dark armor, stood sentinel outside her door, their presence a clear message. She was not a queen, she was a captive, a dangerous anomaly to be contained. Hours passed. Food was brought on a simple tray and left by the door, but she had no appetite. She paced the chamber, the stone cold beneath her bare feet, her mind a whirlwind. What had happened? The beast within the most powerful alpha in the world had knelt before her. He had called it sorcery, but it felt deeper than that. An ancient instinctual truth that had shaken them both to their core. The fear he had shown her, that raw, naked vulnerability, had been a revelation. It had stripped away the monster and revealed the man, a man completely undone by a power he could not comprehend. Late in the afternoon, the lock scraped, and the door swung open. Sebastian stood there, framed by the dim light of the corridor. He had changed into fresh leathers, and the mask of the ruthless king was firmly back in place, but it didn't quite fit. The lines around his eyes were tighter, and the raw confusion she had seen last night still flickered in their depths. A banked fire he was desperately trying to smother with anger. He strode into the room, his presence once again shrinking the space, but he kept his distance, stopping near the hearth, a deliberate chasm of stone floor between them. "Do not think I am a fool," he began, his voice a low growl, each word laced with suspicion. He did not look at her, focusing instead on the dying embers of the fire. "I do not know what trick you played last night, what southern spell you wove, but it will not work again. I will know what you did. I will tear the truth from you if I must." Aria lifted her chin, the spark of defiance she had nurtured on her journey fanning into a small flame. "I did nothing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was your wolf, not my spell." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing. "My wolf is a part of me. It does not bow, not to anyone." He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to retreat. "You are a mystery, Aria of House Dusk, and I do not tolerate mysteries in my citadel. You will remain here until I have answers." He turned and left as abruptly as he had entered, the door locking behind him with a definitive thud. From a shadowed alcove down the hall, Lord Valerius watched the king stride away from the queen's chambers, a thoughtful, dangerous expression on his handsome face. He was Sebastian's cousin, an alpha whose ambition was as sharp as his features. He had noted the king's distraction at the feast, the strange tension that had followed him from the wedding night. Now, seeing the guards posted at the new queen's door, a slow, cruel smile touched his lips. The great King Sebastian, rattled by his pretty new bride. Valerius saw not a mystery, but a weakness, an opportunity. He melted back into the shadows, his mind already spinning webs of intrigue. For 2 more days, Aria remained a prisoner. The confinement was maddening. She felt like a caged bird, her newfound sense of power useless within the 4 walls of her room. On the 3rd day, driven by a desperate need to escape the suffocating chamber, she found a small overlooked door behind a heavy tapestry depicting a great wolf hunt. It was unlocked. Her heart pounding, she slipped through it into a narrow, dusty servant's passage. Keeping to the shadows, she began to explore the onyx citadel, a ghost in her own home. The fortress was a labyrinth of cold stone and stark functionality. Every corridor led to armories, training yards, or barracks. There was no art, no music, only the distant clang of hammers from the forges and the grunts of men sparring in the courtyards. It was a place of relentless, masculine power. Feeling lost and disheartened, she was about to retreat when she came upon a pair of massive, iron-banded doors at the end of a forgotten corridor in the oldest part of the keep. They were covered in a thick blanket of dust, clearly untouched for years. Curiosity overriding her caution, she put her shoulder to one and pushed. It groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the silence, before swinging inward on ancient rusted hinges. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, carrying the scent of dust and decaying parchment, the smell of time itself. She stepped inside, and her breath caught. She had found a library. It was a vast circular chamber, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with towering shelves groaning under the weight of countless books and scrolls. A thick layer of dust covered everything, turning the room into a monochrome landscape of gray. A domed skylight, so grimy it was nearly opaque, allowed only a single, weak column of light to pierce the gloom, illuminating a universe of dancing dust motes. It felt like the only place in the entire citadel that held knowledge instead of just power. A silent, sleeping heart in the body of the beast. "It has been waiting for you." The voice was soft, a dry rustle of leaves, and it came from the deepest shadows of the room. Aria spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Seated in a high-backed chair that had been invisible in the gloom was an old woman. She was ancient, her face a delicate web of wrinkles, her white hair braided with silver threads. But it was her eyes that held Aria captive. They were clouded, a pale, milky white. She was blind. Yet as she turned her head toward Aria, it felt as if she could see her more clearly than anyone. "Who are you?" Aria whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I am Alara," the woman said, her voice calm and steady. "The keeper of this place, the seer of the Duskfall pack, and I have been waiting a very long time, child." Aria took a hesitant step forward. This woman radiated an aura of peace and ancient wisdom that was the complete antithesis of the Citadel's brutal energy. She was not intimidated by Sebastian. Aria could sense that. She spoke of prophecies as if they were simple, immutable facts. "Waiting for me? Why?" Alara smiled. A faint, knowing expression. "Because the signs were read. A new queen from the south. A failing line. A bargain of survival. And a king whose wolf has never known submission." Aria's breath hitched. "You know." It wasn't a question. "I do not see the world as you do," Alara said, gesturing to her clouded eyes. "But I see the threads that weave it together. I felt the tremor when the Alpha's spirit knelt. The entire citadel felt it. Though only the king knew its source." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "He thinks you are a witch. He is afraid. Tell me, child, what do you think you are?" The question hung in the dusty air. Aria looked down at her hands, the hands that had brought the Alpha King to his knees. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The king, his wolf, it knelt. He thinks I'm a witch." "Am I?" "No," Alara said with absolute certainty. "The moonstone does not choose a witch, child. It chooses its vessel." She rose slowly, her movements graceful despite her age, and beckoned Aria deeper into the library. "Come, it is time you understood." Alara led her not with sight, but with an unerring sense of place, her hand brushing against the spines of books as she passed. She stopped before a small locked lectern in the very center of the room. From a pouch at her belt, she produced an old ornate iron key and unlocked it. She lifted the heavy cover, revealing a single massive tome bound in what looked like wolf hide, its cover bare except for a single inlaid piece of polished moonstone that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. "This is the Chronos Volin," Alara said, her voice filled with reverence. "The Book of Ages. It holds the history of our line and its future." She opened the book, its ancient, brittle pages crackling in protest. The script inside was not the common tongue, but a flowing runic language of elegant, interlocking symbols. Alara's fingers, gnarled with age, traced a line of text near the center of a page. "What does it say?" Aria asked, leaning closer, drawn by an irresistible pull. "It tells the prophecy of the Sunstone Alpha and the Lunar Queen," Alara explained, her blind eyes seeming to read the words on the page. "The line of Duskfall carries the spirit of the Sunstone, a fire that burns for dominance, for power, for conquest. It is a line of great kings, but also of great tyrants. Your line, the line of Morgan, though faded, carries the dormant seed of the Moonstone, a power of intuition, of balance, of creation." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The prophecy states that when the Sunstone Alpha's wolf, the embodiment of his fire, willingly bows to a woman, she is revealed as the Lunar Queen, the chosen vessel of the Moonstone. Her touch does not bewitch. It awakens. It awakens the balance that has been lost." Aria stared at the ancient script, her mind reeling. It was not magic. It was destiny, a game far older and more profound than she could ever have imagined. "What does it mean?" Aria asked. "What is this balance?" Alara's expression grew solemn. She traced the final lines of the prophecy. "The Lunar Queen is given a choice, the greatest choice of our age. She holds the power to either quench his fire, to use her influence to break his spirit, shatter his rule, and destroy him, plunging the kingdom into chaos. Or," she lifted her head, her blind gaze piercing, She can forge it into an empire's dawn. She can join her wisdom to his strength, her light to his fire, and together remake this kingdom. She can temper his rage and guide his power, building a new era of justice and prosperity. Alara closed the book, the sound echoing in the vast, silent room. His reign of blood is at its end, Aria, one way or another. The prophecy is not a curse, it is a choice. You are not a pawn in your father's game or a prisoner of your husband. You are the architect of what comes next. The words settled over Aria, not as a burden, but as a mantle of power. The dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light no longer seemed random, but part of a great, intricate design. She looked around the forgotten library, at the decaying knowledge, the oppressive stone of the castle beyond its walls, and she saw it all differently. This was not a prison. It was a battlefield, and for the first time since she had been sold, she finally had a weapon. The knowledge empowered her, a steel core forming in her soul. Her fear, which had been a constant companion, began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She was the Lunar Queen, and the Sunstone Alpha, the ruthless king who held her captive, had no idea that his fate now rested entirely in her hands. The knowledge of the prophecy did not bring peace. It brought a sword. For 2 days, Aria returned to the dusty sanctuary of the library, devouring the histories and lore of the Duskfall kingdom with a hunger she had never known. Ilara would sit with her, a silent, knowing presence, sometimes answering a whispered question, but mostly allowing the ancient texts to speak for themselves. Aria learned of the Sunstone Alphas, a line of kings whose inner fire burned so brightly it often consumed them, leading to reigns of brilliant conquest, followed by paranoid, bloody decline. She learned of the northern clans, not as faceless savages, but as a dozen distinct peoples with their own traditions and grievances. She learned the geography of the kingdom, its hidden passes, its fertile valleys, and its unforgiving winters. She was no longer just a captive. She was a scholar of her own battlefield. On the 3rd day, a royal summons came. The guards at her door, who had been her jailers, were now her escort. Their demeanor had shifted from hostile suspicion to grudging respect. They led her not to the gardens or a sitting room, but to the heart of the Citadel's power, the War Council chamber. The room was an extension of Sebastian himself, stark and intimidating. A massive circular table of dark, scarred wood dominated the space, surrounded by grim, powerful alphas, the generals of his armies. Maps were spread across the table, held down by daggers and stone markers. The air smelled of old leather, steel, and the faint, sharp scent of anxiety. Sebastian stood at the head of the table, his presence a physical weight in the room. He acknowledged her entrance with a curt nod, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. It was not a request. The gesture sent a ripple of shock through the assembled warriors. A woman, the foreign queen, had never before been granted entry to this sanctum. Aria walked to the chair, her back straight, her gaze sweeping over the hard faces that watched her. She saw General Kell, the man who had collected her like a parcel, his expression unreadable. She saw others whose predatory stares had unnerved her at the feast. Today she met their gazes without flinching. The Frostfang clans raid our northern settlements again, Sebastian began, his voice a low rumble that cut through the tension. He pointed a finger at a region on the map marked by jagged mountains. They grow bold. They have sacked the village of White Creek, taken our grain, and killed a dozen of my men. His fist clenched on the table. My strategy is simple. We march north before the snows block the passes. We burn their settlements, salt their fields, and take their elders as hostages. We will make an example of them so stark that their grandchildren will fear the name Duskfall. A murmur of grim approval went through the council. It was the Duskfall way, brutal, direct, and final. But Aria, looking at the map, saw something else. She saw the histories she had read, the stories of the Frostfang clans being pushed further and further into the inhospitable mountains over generations, their desperation fueling their raids. She remembered a passage from a dusty tome about their reverence for the mountain spirits and their reliance on a single, sacred hunting ground for their winter survival. She felt a tremor of fear, but the memory of Ilara's words, "You are the architect of what comes next," gave her strength. She took a breath. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the masculine growl of the council. Every head turned toward her. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. General Kael's eyes narrowed. Sebastian did not look at her, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was listening. "The histories say the Frostfang clans do not fear death," Aria continued, choosing her words with care. "To burn their homes is to make them martyrs. It will not quell their raids. It will fuel them with the fire of vengeance for generations. They will become ghosts in the mountains, and you will spend 100 years hunting them." A grizzled alpha with a scarred face scoffed openly. "And what would you know of it, Your Majesty? Do they fight their battles with poetry in the south?" Aria turned her gaze on him, her expression cool. "I know that a cornered wolf fights harder than one with an escape route. The books in your own libraries say the clans rely on the Valley of the Sleeping Bear for their winter meat. A single pass is the only way in or out. They do not raid for conquest, my lords. They raid because they are starving." She looked back at Sebastian, her eyes locking with his for the first time. "Do not make an example of their people. Make an example of their leader. Block the pass. Seize their winter stores. Their chieftain will be forced to face you, alone, to save his people from starvation. Defeat him, and they will bend the knee. Spare their families, and they will give you their loyalty. You will gain a northern border secured not by fear, but by respect." The silence that followed was profound. The generals stared at her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, grudging comprehension. They were warriors. They understood the logic of a targeted strike, of using an enemy's weakness against them. But the idea of mercy, of offering loyalty instead of demanding submission, was utterly alien to them. They looked to their king, waiting for him to unleash his fury on the woman who dared to question his authority. Sebastian remained silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the map. He traced the line of the mountains with his finger, his mind clearly replaying her words. He was seeing the battlefield not just as a place of conquest, but as a complex web of cause and effect. He was seeing it through her eyes. Finally, he looked up, not at her, but at his council. "The Queen's counsel is unexpected," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We will consider this new approach. The council is dismissed." He turned and strode from the room without another word, leaving Aria alone in a sea of stunned and suspicious alphas. The court gathering that evening was thick with whispers. News of the Queen's unprecedented intervention in the War Council had spread like wildfire. Aria felt the shift in the way people looked at her. The contempt and pity had been replaced by a wary curiosity, and from some, a flicker of open hostility. She stood near the great hearth, the warmth of the flames doing little to chase away the chill of isolation. Lord Valerius moved through the crowd like a handsome shark, his charming smile a weapon. He had spent the afternoon stoking the fears of the more conservative lords, whispering of southern witchcraft and a king gone soft. He saw his moment and seized it, stepping into the center of the hall and raising a silver goblet of mead. "My lords, ladies," his voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. "A toast." He smiled, his eyes glittering with malice as they found Sebastian, who stood across the room. "A toast to the king's newfound prudence, and to our beautiful queen," his gaze slid to Aria, slick and insulting, "whose gentle southern disposition has clearly taught us that the wolf's bite is perhaps less effective than its thoughtful contemplation." A wave of nervous laughter rippled through the hall. The challenge was unmistakable. a poisoned dart aimed directly at Sebastian's authority, implying his new bride had unmanned him. The air grew thick with tension. The Alphas looked to their king, expecting an explosion of rage, a violent reprimand that would put the ambitious Valerius back in his place. Sebastian's face was thunderous, his hand balling into a fist at his side. But before he could move, before the violence could erupt, Aria stepped forward. She moved from the shadows of the hearth into the full light of the hall, her posture regal, her expression serene. The thrill of power, cold and sharp, shot through her. This was her choice, her battlefield. "My Lord Valerius," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a calm authority that cut through the tension. "You mistake wisdom for weakness." Valerius's smile faltered. He had not expected her to speak. A king who considers all paths before spilling the blood of his soldiers is a king who values his people, Aria continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled lords. Her words a direct refutation of Valerius's insinuation. An alpha who only knows how to attack is merely a beast, driven by instinct alone. Our king, she turned her head, her eyes finding Sebastian's across the room, a silent message passing between them, is more than that. He is a strategist, a leader who understands that true strength lies not in relentless aggression, but in the wisdom to know when to show restraint. Your haste for blood, my lord, speaks not of concern for the kingdom, but of a shallow ambition that would see our warriors die for your own glory. A collective gasp went through the court. She had not only defended the king, she had taken Valerius's own words and twisted them into a condemnation of his character, exposing his reckless ambition for all to see. His charming facade cracked, revealing the venomous fury beneath. His face flushed a dark red, his hand tightening on his goblet. He was publicly shamed, outmaneuvered not by the king's fist, but by the queen's words. As he stood there, speechless with rage, Sebastian began to move. He crossed the hall, his steps deliberate and powerful, his eyes never leaving Aria. The crowd parted before him like water before the prow of a warship. He was not looking at Valerius. He was looking at her, and the thunder in his expression had been replaced by a dangerous, gleaming light, a look of raw, grudging admiration. He saw her then, not as a witch, not as a mystery, not as a southern lamb, but as a queen, an equal. He stopped beside her, so close their shoulders almost touched. Then, in a move that stunned the entire court into absolute silence, he reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was immense, a heavy, possessive gesture that was both a comfort and a claim. It sent a jolt of heat through her, a current of shared power that bound them together in that moment. Sebastian's voice boomed through the hall, each word a hammer blow of authority. "Lord Valerius is right about one thing," he said, his gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge him. "The Queen's counsel is new to this court." He paused, his grip tightening ever so slightly on Aria's shoulder. "You would all be wise to listen to it as I do." He let that sink in before delivering the final, lethal blow. "She is your queen. Accord her that respect, or you will answer to me." The threat was naked, absolute. He had not just defended her, he had publicly endorsed her, elevating her from a foreign bride to a center of power in his court. He had drawn a line in the stone, placing her firmly on his side of it. The tentative alliance born in the library had just been forged into a public reality. Valerius stood humiliated, his hatred now a burning fire directed at them both. The game had changed. The shifting court had found its new poles of power, and as Aria stood beside the king, feeling the warmth of his hand through her dress, she felt a spark of something new ignite between them, an attraction born not of prophecy or duty, but of mutual, dangerous strength. The morning after the public humiliation of Lord Valerius, Sebastian found Aria in the library. She was perched on a tall ladder, her back to the door,
carefully pulling a heavy, leather-bound scroll from a high shelf.
The single column of dusty light from the grimy skylight haloed her, turning the stray strands of her hair to spun gold. He had come to see her, drawn by a force he no longer bothered to fight. But seeing her there, so at home in the heart of his fortress's forgotten knowledge, crystallized a new and urgent fear in his mind. Her intellect, the very weapon she had used to defend him, had also painted a target on her back. Valerius and others like him would not challenge him with steel, not yet. They would try to remove the new, unexpected piece on the board. They would try to remove her. "You need to learn how to defend yourself," he said, his voice startling her. Aria gasped, her fingers fumbling the heavy scroll. She turned on the ladder, her eyes wide, as it tumbled from her grasp. Sebastian moved with the fluid grace of a predator, crossing the space in 2 long strides, and catching it an inch before it hit the stone floor. He stood below her, the scroll cradled in one arm, looking up at her. The air between them was thick with the memory of his hand on her shoulder, the public declaration he had made. "I can't be everywhere, Aria," he said, his voice softer now, a low rumble meant only for her. "The words you spoke last night were true and sharp. They made you allies, but they also made you enemies. I will not have you be defenseless." An hour later, she stood in the main training yard of the Onyx Citadel. It was a world away from the silent library. The yard was a sprawling expanse of packed earth and mud, ringing with the clang of steel on steel, and the grunts of half-naked warriors. The air was sharp with the smell of sweat, mud, and metal. It was a place of brutal, masculine energy, and her presence in a simple tunic and leggings drew more than a few curious and incredulous stares. Sebastian ignored them all. He pressed a dagger into her hand, its hilt cool and solid against her palm. The blade was simple, unadorned, and lethally sharp. "This is not a toy," he said, his voice all business. He stood behind her, his body a wall of heat at her back. His large hands closed over hers, adjusting her grip on the hilt, a jolt less violent than their first touch, but just as potent, shot up her arm. "Your knuckles here, your thumb here, a firm grip, but not a stranglehold. You must be able to move, to turn the blade." His hands moved to her waist, then her shoulders, adjusting her stance. Feet apart, knees bent. "You are not a statue, you are a spring, coiled and ready to move." Every touch was impersonal, the instruction of a master to an apprentice. Yet it felt intensely intimate. His breath stirred the hair at her temple as he leaned in, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "The goal is not to win a duel. The goal is to survive long enough for help to arrive, to create an opening, to escape." The lessons were intense. He was a harsh, demanding teacher, pushing her past the point of exhaustion. He showed her how to block, how to parry, how to use an attacker's momentum against them. He taught her where to strike, not to kill, but to maim, to disable. The hollow of the throat, the soft tissue under the arm, the back of the knee. It was a brutal education, a dance of violence and intimacy that unfolded under the gray dusk-fall sky. A lesson on blocking a downward strike became a near embrace, his arm caging her in as he demonstrated the counter move. A drill on parrying a thrust brought their faces so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, her breath catching in her throat as his own hitched. The air between them crackled with an unresolved tension that had nothing to do with the daggers in their hands. For Aria, the training was a revelation. She felt a new power awakening in her body, a physical confidence that complemented the intellectual power she'd found in the library. She was clumsy, her muscles screaming in protest, but she was learning. She was not just a mind. She was a body, capable of more than she had ever imagined. For Sebastian, it was a unique form of torture. He was teaching the woman who was becoming the center of his world how to kill, how to inflict pain, while every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to lock her away in the highest tower where nothing could ever harm her. He watched her, her brow furrowed in concentration, her face smudged with dirt, and he felt that grudging admiration he'd discovered in the throne room bloom into something deeper, something dangerously close to reverence. Days later, Aria was returning from the library, her mind full of ancient histories. She took a secluded side corridor, a shortcut she had discovered, its walls damp and cool. The torchlight was sparse here, casting long dancing shadows. The attack came without warning. 2 figures melted out of the shadows in front of her, while a third blocked the corridor behind. They were not dressed in dustfall leather, but in dark, practical clothing that allowed for silent movement. They were lean, wiry men, their faces hard and emotionless. Foreign assassins. Aria's heart leaped into her throat, a cold wave of pure terror washing over her. There was no time to scream. The one in front lunged, a long knife flashing in the torchlight. The hours of brutal training with Sebastian took over. Instinct, honed by repetition, made her move. She did not freeze. She dropped, the assassin's blade whistling through the air where her head had been. She brought her own dagger up, just as Sebastian had taught her, not in a wild swing, but in a short, sharp jab aimed at the man's exposed thigh. The blade sank in, and the man grunted in pain and surprise. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with disbelief. They had expected a soft, frightened noblewoman, not a cornered cat with claws. She used his shock to scramble back, putting space between them, her dagger held in a trembling but steady grip. She was not a warrior, she knew that. But she was no longer a helpless victim. She could fight. She could hold her own for a few precious moments. The bond that had been growing between them, the invisible thread woven from prophecy and burgeoning emotion, was no longer a subtle thing. For Sebastian, standing in the war council room, it manifested as a sudden, violent jolt. It was not a sound or a premonition, but a physical sensation, an ice, cold spike of pure terror that stabbed into his chest. A fear so profound and absolute he knew, with sickening certainty, that it was not his own, it was Aria's. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout orders or explain. He simply moved. He exploded from the room, his chair crashing to the floor behind him. The alphas in the council stared in shock as their king sprinted down the corridor, his face a mask of terrible fury. He was a storm, a force of nature unleashed, his wolf roaring in his mind, not with dominance, but with a savage, protective rage. He knew where she was. The bond was a beacon, pulling him toward her terror. He skidded around the corner into the secluded corridor, and the scene that met his eyes sent a wave of murderous fury through him. Aria, her face pale but determined, was holding off 2 of the assassins, her dagger a small flicker of light in the gloom. A third was closing in behind her. The fight was brutal, swift, and utterly one-sided. Sebastian didn't fight like a man. He fought like an apex predator. His movements were a terrifying spectacle of controlled rage, each strike precise and lethal. The first assassin died with a shattered windpipe before he could even register the king's presence. The second had his arm broken and was slammed into the stone wall with enough force to crush his skull. Aria could only watch in stunned awe as the man she knew as a king, a husband, a teacher, became a whirlwind of destruction. The third assassin, seeing his companions dispatched with such terrifying efficiency, made a final desperate move. He ignored the king and lunged past him, his blade aimed directly at Aria's heart. Sebastian roared, a sound of pure, primal fury. He moved without thought, without calculation. He threw himself in front of her, his body a living shield. The assassin's blade, meant for Aria, sank deep into Sebastian's side. The man had a moment to look surprised before Sebastian's hand closed around his throat, and with a final sickening crack, the last assassin crumpled to the floor. The corridor fell silent. The only sounds the dripping of blood onto the stone and their own ragged breaths. Sebastian stood over the dead man, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling with the force of his rage. He turned slowly, his eyes wild, and they swept over Aria, checking her for any injury. He was bleeding heavily, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his leather tunic, but his only concern was for her. He stumbled toward her, his hand reaching out to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, as if to reassure himself she was real, she was unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his voice raw. Aria shook her head, unable to speak. She reached out and pressed her hand against the wound in his side, her fingers coming away slick and warm with his blood. The sight of it, the reality of the wound he had taken for her, broke through her shock. Back in their chambers, the royal healers, a grim, elderly man and his 2 apprentices, rushed in with bandages and potions. Sebastian was slumped in a chair, his face pale, his breathing shallow. "Out," Aria said, her voice ringing with a command she didn't know she possessed. The old healer looked at her, affronted. "Your Majesty, the king is grievously wounded. He needs immediate—" "I said out," Aria repeated, her gaze as hard as iron. "I will tend to him." The healer looked to Sebastian, who gave a weak but definitive nod. "Do as the queen commands," he ordered, his voice strained. The healers bowed stiffly and retreated, leaving them alone. The last of their emotional walls crumbled in the quiet of the chamber. Aria knelt before him, her hands gentle as she peeled away the blood-soaked leather of his tunic. The wound was deep, a vicious gash just above his hip. The act of tending to him was more intimate than any caress. She cleaned the wound with warm water, her touch steady and confident, her focus absolute. He watched her, his expression stripped of all its royal authority, leaving only a raw vulnerability. The king was gone, and only the man remained, a man who had willingly bled for her. As she worked, stitching the wound with a neatness that surprised them both, a single tear escaped her eye and fell onto his skin. "I was so afraid," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. "Not of them, of losing you." It was a confession, a declaration more powerful than any vow. Her fear was no longer of him, but for him. He reached out, his hand weak but firm, and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking away the tear track on her cheek. His own eyes were bright with an emotion so fierce it took his breath away. "Let them try," he said, his voice raw with a devotion that was both terrifying and beautiful in its intensity. "Let all the hells try. No one will ever harm you again." He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "You are the heart of this kingdom, Aria. You are my heart." The prophecy was not just about power or politics. They both saw it then, in the quiet intimacy of the firelit room. It was about balance, his strength and her wisdom, his fire and her light. They were 2 halves of a whole, a king forged in violence and a queen born of sacrifice, destined to complete one another. The love that bloomed between them in that moment was not soft or gentle. It was a fierce, protective, absolute thing, forged in shared danger and sealed with a vow of blood. As Aria finished her work and leaned into his embrace, the forced marriage, the terrifying bargain, melted away, leaving only a man and a woman, a king and a queen, finally, irrevocably, one. The fragile piece of the chamber, woven from confession and sealed with blood, was shattered by a sound that belonged to a different world. It began as a single, frantic clang, a discordant note in the quiet heart of the citadel. Then another joined it, and another, until the air itself was vibrating with the cacophony of alarm bells. It was the sound of war, the sound of a siege. Valerius had not waited. His assassins had failed. His treason was exposed, and he had moved to open rebellion with the swiftness of a striking viper. Sebastian pulled away from Aria, the tenderness in his eyes instantly replaced by the hard, cold flint of the Alpha King. He rose, his wound a dull ache he completely ignored, his body already shifting into the familiar rhythms of command. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice the low growl of a warrior. "Bar the door. I will not have you anywhere near the fighting." But Aria was already on her feet, her mind racing. The girl who had trembled in her father's study was gone. The woman who had faced down assassins and tended to the king's wounds stood in her place. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I am your queen. My place is not hiding in a locked room while my kingdom is under attack. My place is with you." For a moment, he looked as if he would argue, his instinct to protect her warring with the newfound respect in his eyes. He saw the steel in her gaze, the unshakable resolve, and he knew it was useless. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Then stay by my side," he commanded, and the words were not a concession, but an acceptance of their new reality. They were in this together. The Onyx Citadel was a war zone. Valerius's rebel faction, bolstered by mercenaries and discontented lords who chafed under Sebastian's iron rule, launched a direct assault on the main gate. Battering rams pounded against the thick iron and wood, and siege ladders scraped against the high stone walls. The air was filled with the screams of men, the clash of swords, and the thrum of arrows. Sebastian was a whirlwind of destruction on the battlements, his great sword a blur of silver, his presence a beacon of terrifying strength for his warriors. He moved along the walls, a force of nature, shoring up defenses, cutting down any rebel who dared to crest the parapet. He was in his element, the Sunstone Alpha, a creature of fire and battle. But this was not a war won by fire alone. Aria, who Sebastian had ordered to the relative safety of the central keep, did not remain idle. She was not a warrior, she could not swing a sword, but she had other weapons. Her mind, honed by the ancient texts in the library, and her knowledge of the Citadel's secrets, became the hidden force of the defense. While Sebastian was the roaring fire on the walls, Aria became the cool, calculating mind in the shadows. She found the master of the guard, a grizzled old wolf named Torvin, his face a mask of disbelief at seeing his queen in the chaos of the armory. "The western wall is undermanned," she told him, her voice calm and clear over the din of battle. "Valerius is feigning his main assault on the gate. He will try to scale the western wall where it overlooks the cliff. There is a hidden servants' passage that runs from behind the kitchens, directly to the base of that wall. Take 50 of your best men. Now." Torvin stared at her, his mind struggling to comprehend. He looked toward the main gate, where the sounds of fighting were loudest, then back at the strange, determined queen. He had heard the whispers of her counsel, of the king's new trust in her. He made a decision. He bowed his head. "As you command, your majesty." Aria did not stop. Using the labyrinth of secret passages she had discovered during her imprisonment, she moved through the castle like a ghost, a silent commander coordinating the defense from within. She directed a group of archers to a forgotten parapet that gave them a perfect flanking position on the rebels attacking the gate. She had servants pour boiling oil from murder holes she had read about in the Citadel's original blueprints, passages that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. She emerged in the kitchens, organizing the staff to carry water to the defenders and to prepare makeshift bandages. She was everywhere and nowhere, her strategic mind a counterpoint to Sebastian's brute force. The soldiers, who had first seen her as a fragile southern doll, began to look at her with a new, dawning respect. They saw her dirt, streaked face, her calm authority, and they saw a queen worthy of their loyalty. The final confrontation was inevitable. Valerius, his assault on the walls failing thanks to a defense that was both ferocious and unexpectedly cunning, grew desperate. He gathered his elite guard, his personal retinue of alphas, and made a final suicidal push for the heart of the kingdom's power, the throne room. He would kill Sebastian and take the obsidian throne, or he would die in the attempt. Sebastian, sensing the shift in the battle, the desperate charge aimed at the keep, met him there. The great hall was in ruins. The long feasting tables were overturned, the battle banners torn and smoldering, the floor littered with the dead and dying. It was a fitting arena for the final, brutal duel. Valerius stood before the obsidian throne, his handsome face twisted into a snarl of hatred and ambition. "You've grown soft, cousin," Valerius spat, his sword held ready, letting a woman fight your battles for you. "She is more of a ruler than you could ever be," Sebastian growled, his own great sword held loosely in his hand. He was no longer the hot-headed tyrant. He was fighting for his kingdom, for his queen, for the future she had shown him. He was fighting for their empire of dawn. The duel was not a clash of equals. Valerius was skilled, driven by a lifetime of bitter jealousy, but Sebastian was a master. He fought with a controlled ferocity, his movements economical and deadly. He was not just a beast of rage, he was a seasoned warrior, and now he had something more than just power to fight for. He parried Valerius's frantic attacks, his blade a wall of steel, his eyes cold and focused. He saw the opening, the moment of overreach, and he moved. With a powerful twist of his wrists, he disarmed his cousin, sending Valerius's sword clattering across the stone floor. He kicked Valerius's legs out from under him, sending him crashing to his knees before the obsidian throne. Sebastian placed the tip of his great sword against Valerius's throat. It was over. The surviving lords and soldiers poured into the ruined throne room, their faces grim, their swords still dripping with blood. When they saw Valerius on his knees, a great savage roar went up. "Traitor!" they screamed. "Blood for blood! Execute him!" It was the old way, the only way they knew. Vengeance was the law of the Duskfall kingdom. Sebastian stood over his defeated cousin, his chest heaving. The beast within him roared for the kill, for the final satisfying act of dominance, but he looked past the snarling faces of his men, his gaze searching the crowd until it found hers. Aria stood near the entrance, her face pale but her eyes clear and steady. He looked at her, and in that single, silent glance, he yielded. He had won the battle, but the war for the soul of their kingdom would be decided now by her. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, deferring the judgment, the future, to his queen. The entire hall fell into a dramatic, shocked silence. Every eye turned from the defeated traitor to the foreign queen. They had seen her brilliance in the defense of the citadel, but this was something else entirely. The Alpha King, the absolute ruler, was giving his power away. Aria walked forward, her simple tunic stained with soot and grime, her steps sure and steady on the blood-slicked stone. She stopped before the kneeling Valerius, who looked up at her with eyes full of venomous hatred. She looked at him, at the blood and destruction that surrounded them, at the faces of the men who thirsted for more violence, and she made her choice. "We have had enough bloodshed," she said, her voice ringing with a clear, unwavering authority that no one dared to question. "This kingdom will not be built on vengeance. It will not be healed by more death." She looked at the assembled lords. "Lord Valerius will be banished. He will be stripped of his title and his lands, and he will be exiled beyond the northern mountains, to live out his days in the frozen wastes he sought to give to our enemies. His lands will be forfeit to the crown, to be distributed to the families who suffered in this war, to rebuild what his ambition has destroyed. Let his name be a lesson in ambition, not a martyr's cry for revenge." A murmur went through the crowd, a sound of confusion, of disbelief, but also of a dawning, reluctant understanding. It was a judgment of wisdom, not of rage. It was a judgment that looked to the future, not the past. Sebastian lowered his sword and pointed to the guards. "You heard your queen," his voice boomed, enforcing her judgment without hesitation. "Take him away." As Valerius was dragged from the hall, screaming curses, A new era for the Duskfall Kingdom had truly begun. Months later, the Onyx Citadel was being reborn. The sounds of battle had been replaced by the sounds of construction, the ring of hammers and the shouts of masons. The most profound change was in the Great Hall. The old, narrow arrow slits were being widened, and massive windows were being installed, designed to let the morning sun stream into the heart of the fortress. The oppressive shadows were receding. Aria and Sebastian stood on a balcony overlooking the work, the cool morning air fresh and clean. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. They ruled together now, a true partnership. Aria, with her deep knowledge of history and law, had drafted a new code for the kingdom, one that valued justice and unity over brute force. Sebastian, with his unmatched authority, enforced it, his strength now tempered by her wisdom. The kingdom was healing, the old wounds slowly beginning to close. The prophecy had been fulfilled. His fire had not been quenched. It had been forged, guided by her devotion, into the foundation of a new golden age. An empire of dawn, Aria whispered, watching the first rays of sun touch the newly installed glass of the throne room window, scattering light across the obsidian throne. Our empire, Sebastian murmured against her ear, his hand resting protectively over their unborn child. A new life for a new kingdom. She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to cup his scarred cheek. The ruthless Alpha King, the man forged in violence, looked at her with eyes full of a love so profound it had remade his world. He had been sold a bride, a piece of property to seal a bargain. But in her, he had found his heart, his balance, his queen. And Aria, the girl who had been sold as a pawn, had found not a monster, but a man, and in saving him, had discovered her own power, her destiny, and a love that would become the stuff of legend. The journey that had begun in a cold, silent room of betrayal had ended here in the warm light of a new day, a reign forged in fire and wisdom, a partnership of equals, complete at last.